good morning, everyone, and welcome to our 2023 Juneteenth celebration and our Courageous Conversation. The Courageous Conversation this morning is really just titled The Cookout. And what we wanted to talk about are all the things that are sort of happening. It's a very interesting time in our community, very interesting time in history, sort of as the global economy, global society rebounds from a pandemic in which all facets of occupation, education, and just humanity were impacted. And then as we as a nation start to celebrate the Juneteenth holiday. And I was expressing to the panel earlier this morning how when I grew up in Northeast Ohio, we didn't celebrate Juneteenth. And I was not introduced to the holiday until I went to high school. I went to a historically black high school in Piney Woods, Mississippi. And that was the first time I was introduced to the holiday of Juneteenth. And I remember feeling like there was some part of my identity that had been left behind that I didn't know about, that my peers had grown up in this society that had been celebrating this celebration for our people specifically their entire lives, and I didn't get introduced to it until late into my teenage years. And now as an adult, as I introduce the holiday to my children, it's actually a federal holiday by which they will be off of school and off of work. And so it's so important, I think, for us to stop and collectively talk about, first of all, what that means. What has that meant? What does that journey to get us here look like? How do we understand Juneteenth and how were we introduced to it? And then for us to, as a community, talk about what do we want the Juneteenth holiday to look like so that it's not commercialized and monetized by other economic entities, and then it overlooks the meaning of the actual holiday for the community members by which it is really symbolic. So with that said, I just want to say good morning to our panelists, to thank you all for being here, to say good morning to the CSU community for joining us and the community that will be joining us around. This is a live discussion that will be filmed at a later date. So with that said, I also want to welcome our panelists and invite them to introduce themselves and to share a little bit about their profession and to share about how their profession and their personal lives have also intersected with the holiday for Juneteenth. And then we'll pick up with some questions and then take some questions from the audience. So with that, I'll leave it to the panel.
I guess I'll start. So I'm Mary Louise Tatum. I'm a psychiatric nurse practitioner. I currently work in outpatient psychiatry. I am impacted because, professionally at least, because there's a lot of self-esteem issues of being like who we are and knowing our identity, you know, so it's like a lot of times the commercials and TikTok and Instagram on all the social media is like identifying who we are instead of us doing it ourselves. So that has been a problem that has led to depression, anxiety, lack of sleep, and you know, so just being able to function. So instead of like thriving, a lot of times people are surviving. So I deal a lot with that. I have a lot of young people now who are in their teens. And I wish I can get to them younger. So actually I plan to. I'm actually going to start working I got a grant recently, and I'm going to start working in the Glenville community actually with at the churches, trying to work with the stakeholders and trying to like start with all ages, you know, to discuss mental health and how it impacts us, how it manifests in physiological illnesses, you know. So what's here does come out here, good or bad, depending on where you are. And as far as personally, well, I don't want to keep talking. I'll pass that on and get back to that.
Hi, everyone. My name is Keisha Wilson. I am a multi-site branch manager at Citizens Bank. And similar to Mr. Pratt, Juneteenth for me was just recently introduced in every day. Like I heard rumblings from my, you know, elders in the family who grew up in the South, but that kind of died down. How it collides with me professionally, in terms of economic resources and financial literacy, what we see is that, you know, not making sure that we are financially stable, not passing that on to our children, not getting to them young enough, where other cultures, other people with economic resources start at age 0 saving their monies and their assets. There's just a disconnect. In Ohio, they passed a law that says that you have to offer financial literacy in high school before graduating. However, I would charge each and every person that that is still too late, because once you're in high school learning, you've already, you know, been surpassed from people who are starting at birth. So I'll pass it on to my co-panelist, Mr. Parker.
All right, I'm Johnny Parker. I'm the husband of Levita Parker. And by day, So I have a couple of jobs, guys, so bear with me. By day, I work with Health and Human Services as a case review facilitator. And so what does that mean? We look at any time a child may be touched or moved by care or become court involved. And when I say removed, removed from their biological families, you're gonna meet with me or one of my now 14 colleagues where we will be making or guiding the team towards decisions. And we're gatekeepers for agency policy and the law, and then best practices. And so that's what I do by day. I'm here in a capacity as a consultant for Shock LLC, where I'm the principal consultant. And I do a lot of community outreach projects. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is a hotbed thing. It's the buzz for the last several years. And so how I'm impacted by the Juneteenth thing is I learned about Juneteenth because I was hired to do work on Juneteenth, and I had to Google what Juneteenth was because I was not taught institutionally about Juneteenth, coming through public schools and then going to private schools and then, college and grad school. No one mentioned Juneteenth. And so it's interesting when you have institutions that are not historically Black bringing you in to do Black programming. So we'll talk about that a little bit later in this discussion.
I am Laquana Cherie Graham. I'm the author of 5 books that are women's help books. I am also a public servant for the city of Cleveland for the last 20 plus years. Juneteenth has definitely impacted our city of Cleveland. As you know, it's over half of the employees with City of Cleveland are African American, so definitely made an impact for us. I am also a realtor, and that's all.
So as you can see, we have a very diverse panel, right? And one of the things that a common thread that you all sort of touched on is how you either intersect or overlay for programming. And one of the things that I think is a very interesting conversation, kind of where we can start to talk and to build some understanding, is how the program, the idea of Juneteenth as a program is now, we have to look at it from all different aspects economically. All right, so this year my family traveled for Memorial Day. And I remember not only is this now one of the largest traveling holidays for the country, right? Sometimes people overlook why Memorial Day is actually a holiday. And Memorial Day is very much connected to the Civil War. And so it was a day to memorialize all of the collective loss of life that happened at the Civil War as a result of. And so when we think about Juneteenth now, as it is a federal holiday on Monday, and we think about, so now we have thinking for my family, is this a holiday that we now travel on, right? And if we travel, then what does that mean for us catching deals? And how does that mean for institutions who are now advertising because they recognize that there's going to be this sort of consciousness and there's going to be this opportunity to engage with consumers who are now off of work, but then also keeping the idea of the holiday and what the holiday means sort of symbolically to the culture, sort of pure and organic to the culture. And I think economically, from the aspect of financial literacy, teaching our young people not only how to celebrate the holiday, but how do we plan for Juneteenth economically over the course of their lifetime, so that it isn't something that we're just introducing them to, it is something that they learn to benefit from, that they plan for, that they include in their growth. But then also, as you talked about authoring the books, how do we help them to build the identity so that Juneteenth isn't a point of shame, right? And it is just not symbolizing all the bad things that happen, but we see the intersection of programming and an opportunity for financial literacy, programming, and for community engagement. And so I'll throw that out there. How do we now, as a community, take what we didn't know about Juneteenth, what is historically true about Juneteenth, and blend that into the experience for not just us today, but for the generations coming after us?
Okay, so one of the things that I focus on when I am out in the community teaching financial literacy courses is making sure that people understand how to not only have money and assets, but how to make those assets work for you and to help sustain you and provide generational wealth. So it is super important to look at your resources and say, now that I've accumulated this, how do I monetize this, and actually get granular in understanding how you can double, triple, quadruple those assets and teach that legacy planning so that when you take your business, whether it is doing hair, or when you take your business, whether it is owning or being a doctor, how do we take that and teach our children how to continue that legacy? Or how do we take that and utilize things such as life insurance to help, display and make sure that they are going forward and utilizing the funds for economic freedom and sustaining themselves, right? Because we're at a point in our life where, yes, we know that we have been enslaved. Now, how do we utilize the past and, flip it and move forward? So making sure that we have savings accounts, making sure that when a pandemic happens, we can borrow from ourselves before borrowing from other places. Making sure we understand that home ownership is not just to have a home, not to pay rent, but how can we utilize the asset, the equity in our home so that if another pandemic happens, we already have the equity line sitting there, because what most people do when there is a pandemic or some sort of issue, they run to the bank, not knowing that when you go to the bank after an issue has already started, 9 times out of 10, you no longer qualify, right? You've lost the job, so you don't have the sustainability to repay that obligation. A tree fell on your house from the storm from last night, so your home is under construction, so you no longer qualify because your home is under construction. But making sure that we know the ins and outs and being vocal about how our community, how we're getting the information out there and how often that we're talking about it. So you mentioned something that says, yes, it's a federal holiday, we're off, but are we losing, the reason that we are off, and making sure that we are in some way talking about it. So I charge everyone in here, you've heard the information, tell and talk about what you're learning, what you're understanding. Even if it's the most minimal thing, it could help change people's lives.
Absolutely. I really appreciate that, taking some time on the holiday to just spend and having that conversation. If we, particularly in the Black community, recognize that we may not have this designated time at some other junction. So this time is not just time where we're off, right? This is not we're stopping. This is time where we can have dedicated conversations in the home about things that we may not be able to talk about another day. I'm curious to see, how can we collectively as a community start thinking about how that also blends with identity, right? So we're thinking about how, as we're looking at celebrating Juneteenth in the future, how can we take that and empower ourselves so that it doesn't become the narrative about what happened to us, it becomes about this opportunity that we see coming up in the future.
I would like to see it not so much be a day off, but a day on. So we talked, I think it was MLK Day? We try to turn it into a day on. So how can we take that and be of service to something, make it more than just a cookout? How can we be of service to someone? I know back in the day, we used to, my group and I would get together and we'd go serve the homeless, serve the nursing homes during MLK Day, just to make it a day on, so that we don't lose the significance of service no matter what holiday comes along. So how can we serve and keep it relevant in our minds?
So basically, I think we need to learn not to be shameful of our past. I think that's a huge burden that a lot of people carry. Like, there's a big disconnect from our Southern roots. It's shameful to talk about. I don't think that should be, and we need to realize where we are today. That was through a struggle without anybody or anything, It's God's grace, the community, because we used to have a stronger community. I know, when both of my parents aren't from here, and when they came to Ohio, there was a big support of family and even friends. Like in the apartment building, I have friends who talk about, oh yeah, they aren't their real aunt and uncle, but that's my aunt and uncle, right? Oh, that's auntie this, auntie that, because it was such everyone watched out for each other. And it's like as we acclimated to mainstream society, because we think, oh, I've acclimated, I'm important now, I've made it, I've achieved. Well, if you've achieved with a shame still, trying to deny your past, That's a problem, right? So we need to like be comfortable with who we are. Be comfortable with nappy hair, bald head, chocolate, light, whatever. Our bodies, be comfortable. Learn to love us. And I think we like skip over that all the time to go to the big holidays and stuff. And instead of individual love, do not be ashamed of where you come from, your family. We have come so far from nothing. Not all of us got our 40 acres and a mule. When people came over here from European countries, they were given farmland. They were giving items that we were not given. So people are like, oh, I came over here and struggled. Yeah, but a lot of times you were given things. It's documented. We were not. And we have come so far, and we need to recognize and appreciate who we are. And we need to learn to define who we are. And we do not have to acclimate in mainstream society and live in a certain neighborhood, drive a certain car, wear certain shoes, a certain clothing, have our hair a certain way to be all that. We are all that regardless, and we need to learn to recognize that.
One of the interesting intersections for this, I think, that everyone on the panel may be able to appreciate from their perspective is, I think one of the purest ways that our identities show up is in music and in arts and culture, right? And in spaces where we gather together, the sound of our fellowship is a very real thing, right? And there's a feeling, right? There's an undertow of emotion that goes together. I think when you get us together in a community, right? And what I think is interesting and something I would love to hear you all speak about is how we are recovering from a global pandemic in which now jobs look different. Like people are embracing working from home and the entrepreneurial spirit in a different sort of kind of way. And how have you seen the results of people stopping? Because to me, some of the best music of my generation came out as a result of the pandemic, right? People sitting at home for the first time, and artists were releasing music and videos were coming out. And now the world is, as they say, opening back up, right? How can we take advantage of that and arts and culture in a way that's intentional moving forward? Because I think to your point, we have to see ourselves in a way that's beautiful. Right, we have to be given permission to represent ourselves in a diaspora. So there's not one monolithic way of being, like, right, beauty it comes from all shapes and sizes, and we have to have the conversation of why I may appreciate something you don't, and why you may appreciate something I don't. And I think arts and music is a space that invokes emotion from us. It's not asking for our permission, right? Our talent sometimes is demanding attention, right? And so I'm curious to see, like, what music are you listening to right now? Right, that is inspiring you and sort of keeping with that, and how is that shaping the influence that you would like to have in your own personal life moving forward, right? So music, arts, and culture in your life and how that's driving you.
I'll start off with this. I have a unique take on music, arts, and culture. Most of my community building or outreach projects involve music and music platforms, and so first of all, I think taking ownership through understanding the tradition of music as it relates to the African diaspora or people of color, understanding the tradition of music and how it manifests itself across every genre, in terms of African influence, right? And when you're able to understand the tradition, you can become more comfortable with your identity around your music, and you'll understand what music is birthed out of passion, but also what music is monetized and taken to the market for commercialism. And then you'll understand how music is one of the main sources of marketing and programming. And so when you understand those things, you have to understand the social and emotional aspects of music, how music helps or causes you to react and respond to stimuli, to events, to what happened. Go back to George Floyd. What was the music that was birthed out of that? I do consulting with the Cleveland Orchestra. And what happened is there was an awakening for African American and minority composers that happened as a direct result of George Floyd. And what's happening is people started digging. You know, I was with one of my colleagues at Oberlin, and they just discovered that Nathaniel Dett, an amazing African-American classical composer, was an alum of Oberlin. And they discovered his work. And then one of my colleagues, Dr. Andrews, they actually did a production of his work just this year. And he's an amazing composer. And that was as a result of George Floyd and what happened culturally, right? And so you cannot divorce culture and music. Music in a very real way is born out of a culture, but also it is used to program culture. And so in many ways, our music can be weaponized against us if we don't understand the tradition of it. And in many ways, music can be used to bring us together. And so that's a very important thing. So as I approach Juneteenth, this year I was meeting with family, and I said, what do I want out of Juneteenth? And I said, what I want to do is to establish a tradition based upon the comfort of my identity as it relates to Juneteenth and what happened. I want to establish tradition within my own home. And I would challenge all of us to do that, because that will keep us from becoming over-programmed. Because Juneteenth already is monetized. Walmart had a Juneteenth ice cream. I don't know if y'all know that. Okay? So, listen. Juneteenth is already, before Juneteenth, the federal law was signed into place. The powers that be already figured out how it can become, how they could capitalize and make money on it. So for it to continue to have the meaning for our community, or actually for it to become meaningful, because again, I didn't know about Juneteenth for real until an institution hired me to do programming, because like, you're a good, intelligent, articulate black man, why don't you come in and help us with our diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we've got some money for you.
And I think one of the things you talk about is so powerful in terms of music informing culture, because to the point that was made earlier, a lot of the holidays that we celebrate, we inherited, right? So I wasn't a part of the historic movements that were driving that holiday, whereas Juneteenth is something that's happening right in my lifetime. And so the legacy that my children inherit for the holiday is really being shaped right now. The music that's coming out right now, the conversations right now. And one of the things that we wanted to be intentional about in this conversation are sort of taking a snapshot at the micro ripples, because it isn't in some collective home that we all got the same conversation. It was in our own individual homes that the same conversation was being had. And so when we came out of the homes, we were able to, like, I understood what you understood, like, oh, there are these rules or sort of these sayings in our home, like what happens in the house, stays in the house. Okay, children should be seen in. Right, so I know that didn't just happen in my house, right? Like that clearly happens somewhere else, right? And that is what that speaks to, though, is a collective consciousness, because just like you were saying with music and cues, those are also cues, right? Those are also values that translate into behaviors that we now have an opportunity to influence, because we are taking the time to sort of talk about it. Because if not, then we sort of pass them along without, our children just think, well, that's how it was, so that's how it should be, right? And that's how they celebrate the 4th of July, so that's how we're going to celebrate Juneteenth. No. And if we're intentional now in saying, so we want to stop and have a financial conversation in the morning, right? We want to make the holiday shaped around service and around interaction with the community. We want to be intentional about creating music that can be celebrated and passed down from this generation to the next, so that the message of Juneteenth doesn't get lost. Right, and if we do that, then that will naturally develop into an economic driver, because that music can then be monetized, but then it's still our music. All right, and so I'm curious if we have any thoughts from the audience, any questions around your experiences with Juneteenth, or anything that you've heard from the panel that are questions that you'd like to ask from a particular perspective. Anything from the audience? If not, then my next question is about, so we've talked a lot about what Juneteenth looks like to us. I'm curious as to what our perspective is and how the world is watching how we develop Juneteenth, right? Because as we're now living in a global society, right, as this is an American holiday, an African American holiday, there's so many more identities represented in this country than just African American, right? And so we have the Caribbean influence, we have the African influence, right? We have the European influence. We have to think about how those communities are also watching us perform, engage, and interact with this holiday. And so I'm just curious as to what some of our world travelers have seen from the rest of the world. Right now, I think in history is one of the most interesting times for hip hop, as it celebrates 50 years this year, right? But the largest acts in hip hop right now are not American acts. So this is one of the first times that hip hop is on a global scale. It's being celebrated for 50 years, but it's also the first time where you can have international artists headlining stadium tours in the United States. That couldn't have happened 15 or 20 years ago. So there is some globalization that's happening right now in the music, right? Where you have American artists that have always toured overseas, but now something's happening with the music where you have international artists coming to the United States. Right, and so what is happening there? I think that's very interesting for us. And how can we take that energy and sort of keep the momentum going? As you said, so how does the 6th book become about Juneteenth, right? And how do we include that message so that my children can then not only get the self-help, but then they also still keep the message of Juneteenth?
For me, I definitely I believe in guarding my ears and guarding my eyes. I'm very particular about what I listen to, what I watch on television. All of that is so relevant to me. I try to make sure that have music playing constantly. Even at work, I have YouTube playing. There may be a sermon in the background or gospel jazz playing in the background, so that I'm constantly being ministered to, because there's so much going on in the world, right? Everybody going through something. So it's important to me that I guard, I'm not giving different shows my attention. I don't care what's popular. I'm very intentional about what I listen to and whom I'm around. All of that's so relevant to me for my 6th book. Okay, so when I'm speaking to audiences that are underneath the age of 18, I'm wanting to lead by example. I believe in being aware, but also I don't have to engage in what everyone else is doing. So trying to show them that just because this person is on the stage naked or doing their thing, no shade to them, do their thing, it doesn't have to be me. And I am trying to be an example of that constantly.
So I think the internet and all this stuff is a blessing and a curse, because I do know, like, before this, there was a lot of stereotyping. I know I lived in Zambia, and mind you, I was going not as a young person, but I was Black American. They're like, oh, show us how to dance. Show us how to do this and that. And I'm thinking, you got the wrong one here. I'm clueless, so it's like, I cannot emulate Beyonce or the videos and all that stuff. I can't teach you anything. But I think it's also awesome because it does give us like recognition of the African roots, and all of that sort of thing, which is beautiful. And it is bringing us together in a different way. Like, I have friends I still talk to in Kenya, Zambia, and different places via WhatsApp, which is awesome. But also, unfortunately, there's still so much stereotyped like stuff out there that they're seeing, and they don't know what's true and what's not true, and we need to like have a better voice. But I do think we have had a voice because we were very successful with Kwanzaa. We did take control of Kwanzaa, and we do celebrate that for the most part pretty much the same across the country. So just like you're trying to empower people to do that with Juneteenth, I think that can happen. And back then, they didn't even have the internet when they did Kwanzaa and made it like more uniformed across the country. Everybody does the 7 principles in a certain order, right? So we have the candle. So just like we did that successfully, I love what you're doing, because we can do this successfully too. And we do have something that we have done. We have a lot of stuff we've done successfully. I'm just using Kwanzaa as one of the examples.
And I love that you use that as an example, because I want to pivot to, there's a conversation that's developing nationally about reparations. That's a national conversation. It's happening on the federal level. It's happening on the state level in many different places, right? And one of the curious sort of contentions is, what does that look like for the community? Like, what does that look like? What does it look like economically, right? Does that look like cash payments? Does that look like equity? Like, what does that look like? What does that look like for the individuals, right? The other part of it is, it isn't just about what is owed financially. What does that mean in the recognition of trauma? to the collective consciousness of the people, because the financial component is only symbolic to the physical trauma of the generations that endured the conditions that they did. And so I'm curious to you in terms of, as we're having the Juneteenth conversation, as it has given us an opportunity to sit down and talk to each other as we go back into our spheres of influence, what are we having the conversations about reparations? And one of the things that you said earlier that I think is interesting is because we've kind of been shamed out of that conversation. You better not talk about that, you might get in trouble. You bring that up, people, that might provoke or incite a negative response. But how can our children be informed about how to sit at the table if we don't have the uncomfortable conversation with them about what to do when they get to the table? Right? And so today would be an opportunity at a Juneteenth celebration for families and for a community to stop and pivot to say, hey, this is what happened historically, right? But this is also what is happening right now on the federal level, right? This is also what's happening right now on the state level. And this is what I need you to be aware of, because by the time you become an active citizen, by the time you're ready to vote, as you're engaging, this is what I need you to be prepared for. Because if not, then it just becomes a conversation that we pass on to the next generation. So I'm curious to know, like, what are your thoughts? Have you had conversations just like with Juneteenth? Because there are pockets of our community that, just like with Juneteenth, because nobody brought to them the conversation, they haven't had it. It's not like they don't have an opinion on it. They haven't had the opportunity to air those opinions out, to flush those out. So for us, just asking, curious, if you have the conversations about reparations, have you heard about them? If so, what does that look like in your particular industry? What does that look like in your profession, right? And what made that look like in your own personal life?
I'll jump in there. Growing up hearing about reparations, right, for 40 acres and a mule, no one really sat down and had the conversation as far as like, what did that look like economically in the 80s, 90s? What does that turn into in terms of money? That discussion back, in yesteryears, 40 acres and a mule, those folks back then knew exactly what that economic impact was. So what is the economic impact? What are we looking like? What does that conversation look like in terms of money? Then also, I think that when you talk about identity, right, being shamed out of that conversation, I think the fact that we've overcome so many obstacles, you talk about trauma. The African diaspora has experienced so much post-traumatic growth. Right? People are, we're achieving, right? But that doesn't mean that the trauma didn't happen, and it doesn't mean that the trauma does not have impact, right? And so how do you reconcile that to the whole conversation? Like, okay, I'm making some strides, I'm doing some things, I'm pulling myself up by that weird conversation, by my own bootstraps. And then should we even be discussing that? Right? And so I think we need to just really just get down to the basics and really have it and say, listen, it's not even a conversation about entitlement. It's a discussion about the hard, solid facts in terms of the trauma that has happened, the traumas that's being proliferated, and then what is our nation, what has been our nation's lack of response to our plight. And then do we stay stuck in terms of being I'm angry about it, or what do we do? And I think we just really need to open that conversation back up, because we cannot afford to have these conversations going on the federal level, and these conversations are not happening in our home. Because if we are handed down something, you're not going to know what to do with it.
So you ended on a statement that was important to me, because once the reparations come, because I speak into my future, so once it happens, what do we do with it, and are we prepared to accept whatever we have come to agree with is the proper reparations? So as you stated, we can't have that conversation on a federal level, but not in the homes celebrating on Juneteenth, or just not even just that day, every day. And I think that that's where we sometimes get lost, that we say, we have to do this on this day. And it should be an everyday, continual conversation to make sure that we are economically stable from, you know, a little child to the eldest of, you know, and making sure that we have established things such as trust to keep assets in the family, to make sure that we have developed just that strong component of understanding how money works, how money moves, who are the people who can influence, impact, direct the funds to where they need to go. My concern is that once the reparations are handed off, how many people know how to utilize assets? And that's my number one concern.
So that question had a lot, but I'm gonna try to keep it down to just one or two because I'm very loquacious, right? Love talking. But I think we're fighting for our lives, not just for reparations, but more than just that. People don't realize that in the state of Ohio here, they have 2 bills out. They're trying to stop DEI from K through 12 and from universities and colleges. And they're trying to hurt people financially. So they're not just like coming small, they're coming hard. They're hurting pocketbooks, you know, so that is serious. And so many people are not aware of what's happening here in Ohio. So as far as reparations, I will claim it. But for right now, I'm fighting for my life, I feel like, because if you take away of me learning about my history, that is a problem. So we need to empower them. People say they're apolitical. You have made a decision. I'm sorry. You have made a decision right there and there. So there's no such thing, especially in today's world. We have to be engaged. We have to empower ourselves. But to do that, we have to love ourselves, including our past. You know, we have to love everything that was about us. And actually, I crack up over my daddy's stories about his poverty stories. So I don't have a problem with it because he made it to like whip us into shape and try to tell us how spoiled we were. I don't know. But I brag about him. I brag about the farm. I brag about him saying he was barefoot in the summer. I don't care, you know, but we will also take into the house my grandpa built for 15 children. You know, my grandma and grandpa, we were taken to that house every year. So I know what it's like to do well water. I know what it's like not chase the chickens around. So I was exposed to that continuously. And I think that's why I have such a pride in my Southern roots and being Black. Grateful for it, actually, you know. So, and my dad made me grateful for it. My family, my uncles, my aunts, like my cousins, they will tell you we have a pride. We're like, oh, we Tatums, you know, even the ones who aren't Tatums, right, because they're from women, we're Tatums, you know, because that's just like what was ingrained in us. And I'm grateful for that, you know. And just like even earlier, I was telling someone like I was blessed to go to St. Aloysius. It's a different being now, but back in the day, it was a Black Catholic school that taught Black pride. Every instructor was white, but they taught Black pride. So I was blessed to have that teaching of Black pride from K through 12. Pictures around with all Black people. Didn't matter. And they were comfortable with us. And they would take us to their homes, you know. So I had a very great exposure as a young person. And I don't think our young people have that today. They have the hip hop and the different people, and I'm okay with hip hop. I love my 80s hip hop. That's the generation I'm from, you know. So I get it. But I think like we need to recognize our value of our yesteryear so we can recognize our value of today, you know, and then I'll be quiet because I can go forever.
So you were talking about growing up and your school, and it made me think. My grandmother and my parents all talk about how they grew up in a Black community where the Black teachers and the Black principals would say, hey, don't make me call your mama, right, or exactly. Don't make me, you know, and they would, you know, they didn't have a problem snatching you up if you were, because it was the community, it was the village, right, that was raising. And then at the point, I think a lot about this, at the point where African Americans became financially successful, pulled that money out of our shared community where there was more socioeconomic diversity. They pulled that money out. I should say we pulled that money out and then left poverty. And we talk a lot about white flight, but also there was some Black flight going on too. And so unfortunately, I guess when we talk about reparations, so having that community, that was important, right? About identity and family and community and supporting each other. And we don't have so much of that anymore. And then as far as reparations go, if we could put money into our cities where where there's poverty in our community, but that would take us coming together, and we don't often want to do that.
This is why I welcome this, and I want the audience to start thinking about if you have last questions for our panel. What's so interesting to me about this, and you talked about post-traumatic growth, and I think that is so important. And then you also talked about surviving the times and for our lives. And I think what I have come to appreciate in my 42 years of life is how so much of my Black identity is caught in between that juxtaposition. Being like the famous, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Like that is literally what it feels like to be Black in America, right? Like today this could be a celebration, but I still have to be present in this body when I leave out of this building, and I need to be conscious of driving on the street and how my interaction could be leaving out of here. But then I may go home to a happy, warm family where I'm embraced, and it's those highs and those lows in which, if we're not intentional, they do have a physiological and physical effect on us. Right? And one of the ways that I think is the most harmful is that we don't talk about it. You know, the anxiety, it manifests in our body, right? The stress, it manifests in our body. And then it bleeds out into our relationships, it bleeds out into our behaviors, but we're not talking about it. And so I may be experiencing it individually, it's happening collectively, and I'm not talking about it. And so there's a tension in the room that's never released because we don't talk about it. And so that hopefully is what this conversation is. It's an intentional release of that tension. And we have to designate safe spaces to have the conversation. I had 10 questions today. I don't have any questions for the next time. Or I might have not had any questions last time. But it's the opportunity to keep coming back to the conversation. I don't know what I was supposed to take away from it, partly because I've never had the opportunity to have the conversation before. If I had had more times to sit around my people and talk, maybe I'd know how to ask more pointed questions. So if I get more opportunities to strategize on how we push back against the de-organization of DEI, if I had more opportunities to sit down with people who were financially literate and talk about how we could manifest into policy, then the next time I'm in my organizational meeting, I might have a better suggestion. But until I can make that personal connection, right? And if I'm sitting down with young people who want to be artists, I can be intentional about introducing them to the revolutionary art of the past as it's influencing what it is that they're creating. But what I'm hearing from everyone on the panel is we've got to be intentional. We are not going to accidentally stumble into greatness. You got to wake up and say that is the destination that I'm heading towards. And if other people can't understand that or can't get with that, I'm sorry, I'll be back to get you when I'm done. And that is really, to me, I can't think of, I remember I went to school in Piney Woods, Mississippi. I remember driving from Jackson, Mississippi to Piney Woods, which is a 29-mile stretch that has no street lights. And I remember the first time I took that drive and the fear of being on a 2-lane highway with 2 lanes this way and 2 lanes that way and no street lights. And I remember thinking to myself, and this is 1998, I'm thinking to myself, like, if I'm this scared in 1998, how fearful could a person have been in 1965, 55? Driving where I don't see anything but the 2 lights headed towards me. But by the time I kept going back to Piney Woods, I don't get fearful on that trip anymore. As a matter of fact, I look forward to that stretch now because it puts me in a place in my consciousness that I wouldn't be on any other stretch of road but on that 29 miles. That's a symbolic place for me I got to come back to. In our communities, in our homes, we got to have these symbolic places to come back to. And so to the point that was made earlier, we can't let Juneteenth get away from us. We got to be intentional that, okay, we know Juneteenth is coming, and you know what that means. That means we're going to sit down in the morning, we're going to do some financial planning. Right? And we can do some vision boarding in your life about what do you want to have when you get older? What do you want to do in the next generation? And we can be intentional about that now so that it's driving our economic progress throughout the year as a family, but then also as a community. As our institutions are waking up to the fact that Juneteenth is a holiday that we have to celebrate, we can be intentional in these spaces about building a strategy so that when we go back to those tables and say, well, how do you want to celebrate it? I think the community is asking for this. And then seeing at the institution will then marry those efforts. I'm so grateful today to have some of our community members here, some of my senior leadership here representing, and just being in the audience. And that type of support, I think, creates the comfort to be able to have these type of conversations, because sometimes people who are watching them don't realize how uncomfortable it is to be in these conversations.
Yes.
Please.
To your point, thank you, the staff, Mr. Pratt, and everyone that's involved in this. We need these kind of conversations. Conversations are so important, because I can remember, I want to say 2020 or 21, I was working as a vendor for a safety fair. And I never felt so unsafe in my entire life to be at the safety fair. Inside, I was trembling. It was officers everywhere. And I'm wondering if I had the wrong shirt, or if I moved the wrong way, what could happen in this space? Or if someone comes, it wasn't in the best area, so if someone comes into the space, what could happen in a matter of seconds? So, and I never got a chance to release that. I had to go home and journal about it as best as I could, because it was such a traumatic experience for me. I said, I'll never go to the safety fair in my life again, just from that encounter. So conversations, being able to have an outlet is so important. That's why I love the idea of having financial planning in the morning, or any other day. I like financial planning, I get my money right. But having those conversations is so important, continual conversations.
But one thing the audience member spoke of is, yes, it takes a collective approach to help pull people up by the bootstraps, right? And making sure that when we're trying to keep up with the Joneses, we're not leaving people behind, right? So in my family, we have people who are all on the same level in terms of worth and value in the family. We have some people who make more than others. We have people who can do different trades. But growing up, you know, we always had Aunt Barbara, who kept all the kids, right? And if anyone has children, you know how expensive daycare is, right? So she was a part of our community. She owned her house. You know, we paid her and she kept her house, you know, but she stayed home. She was the person who stayed home, and everybody knew they were going to Aunt Barbara's house, right? I remember when I got my first corporate job, I moved out into the suburbs. Like, look, mama, I made it, right? And my grandmother, who will not leave her house to this day, who lives on MLK, who says, listen here, just because you go out don't mean that you're doing any better or anything like that. This is still home, right? And anytime there's any event, we all go back home, right? So just when we think of economics, it's not the end all to the be all, right? Every person in your family structure plays an intricate part, right? And it's important to make sure that it's identified, that you know who the resources are in your family, and that you do have that sense of community, because, oh, by the way, if Miss Shields saw us cutting up two houses over, it was a problem, you know? So it's important to make sure that we have that collective community, as you stated.
And I think it's okay for us to have the conversation with everybody and anybody too. I mean, so we need to have it in our homes instead of talking about pop culture and TV and all that stuff. We need to take time out. Like, you know, I'm in the generation where you sat down at dinner. So, and I know that's not a lot anymore, because my godchildren come over and they want to watch TV. And I'm like, no, you have to go to the table, turn the TV off. I take their phones away, but that's not a common thing, because people are tired, right? We know when they were tired back in the day, but I don't know, the endurance, I guess, of stamina has somehow changed over the generations. But, you know, I say that to say you don't have to just have it at home. Because even at my job, I mean, I won't say where I work, but there were no black people on the floor. Even there was like one secretary who was black out of like 5 secretaries, the housekeeper and me. And I was like, I just went to my boss, where are the black people? I don't feel uncomfortable. I don't feel uncomfortable asking. I don't think we should feel uncomfortable. I don't understand why it's uncomfortable. I do, I guess, understand why it's uncomfortable to talk about race. I just don't care. I think it's my perspective, but that comes to where we have to, you know, you have to like stand for something, right? And I refuse. I refuse to tell people to tell me what I can or cannot do because of my race or my sex. You know, I just refuse. And I understand that not everybody is there, but I tell people, go get your therapy, go do what you got to do to get there, talk to your minister, your grandma, auntie, whatever, but talk to somebody so you can get there. And I don't care where you are in life at your age. There is never too late. You can be 80 years old, it is never too late.
And to that point, I want to ask for final questions from the audience, but I also want to say we have to not only be given the opportunity, sometimes we have to be taught how to be courageous. We have to be taught how to be. I'm laughing because in my mind, my direct supervisor is here, Dr. Philip Flap Cockrell, and I remember in our first meetings, he would say to me, "Jared, speak your truth." And I had never had a black supervisor who said that before. And it took a year for me to be able to speak a truth, and because that didn't have to do with the institution, that was me. Right? And so sometimes I think for particularly people who are in positions of mentorship, where you have, we are in an interesting time in the workforce where there are 4 generations represented in the workforce right now. To be intentional about those who have experiences, being intentional with our younger group of participants and informing them, educating them, and also giving them the space to clear their throat, to speak their mind, and to own their truth. Right, and to sometimes that truth may require compromise. It's not how I saw it, not how you saw it, right? But it's the collection, and a rule in our home was it's more important for us to be together than it was for anyone to be right, which meant that there were some times that I could have been right, but I'm choosing to not be right in the moment. I'm choosing to be together, and in moments like this, we make a choice to be together. And there is a power released in us being together that is more powerful than if I was just right by myself. Right? And I think that is so important. So I invite any last questions from the audience. Any last questions from the audience, please?
So how can our white friends celebrate Juneteenth without cultural appropriation?
Such an important question. I leave that to anybody on the panel. Right? Listen, that's such an important, and listen, the first thing I'll say is that's not a loaded question. There's a genuine curiosity about how to do it, right? And so when that question is posed, we have to be able to provide a response that is empowering, right? Absolutely.
Walmart got in so much trouble for that.
They did.
Red velvet ice cream, I was like, I kind of want some.
Is there an answer on the panel, please?
Bring them with you. I mean, my friends, and I live in the inner city still. I live in the house I grew up in. I have a house in the suburbs, but I rent it out because I had to move in with my daddy to take care of him. He died. I stayed there, and it's like my friends come to my house. No matter, all of my white friends come to my house. They don't have a problem with it. They used to come visit my daddy, so they have learned a culture because they wanted to. So these aren't people who are like clueless either, right? We're friends, we're buddies, we have a connection and a rapport, so it's a little different. But people who don't have that, sometimes I may invite them out still, and it's like okay to bring up the conversation, when we talk about different holidays and stuff, not just random out of the blue. If you're talking about work, Juneteenth, but just like when you're talking about holidays, celebrations, because everybody talks about vacations and stuff at some point, right? Because we all desire them, like I desire one, right? So I think during that time period, it's okay to bring it up and talk about it. Anything cultural, and it doesn't have to jump into Juneteenth. It could just be about culture in general, So even with like where I work, a lot of times I get minorities who aren't black to be my patients because they want somebody of color, period. They're desperate for anybody, and they've hired quite a few of us now since George Floyd. And yeah, so and all of us, we have like an abundance of people who are like, and they're not black, and they're like, I didn't want a white provider, so it's okay. And people realize when you're comfortable, and they may be uncomfortable, but I think it's okay to make people uncomfortable. Without being uncomfortable, there is no change. There is no change for any of us.
And we also have to have a pride in the way that it's presented so that we don't have to make excuses and be uncomfortable in the presentation. I have to bring you to something, but I want to show you what I'm proud of. It's much easier for me to include you when I'm comfortable with what I'm including you in, right? When I'm not making do, right? Because when I make do, I got to make excuses. I normally I have 4, but today we're going to have to split. When I have 6 and I'm able to share, I feel better about sharing, right? And that I think that is so reflective for our community, right? Because so often we're operating from a point of what we don't have. And so I think this conversation is intentional about what we could have together. And so I will ask from the panel if there are any final thoughts, anything that you want to leave to the audience, anything that you might want to say to somebody who would see the video later and have questions about Juneteenth. Or you had a question? Oh, please, go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, so the question that I had is, what were some of the problems that you guys faced as African Americans in your line of work? Because I know you all have like completely different jobs, so I just want to hear, and I also want to know, how did you respond, and did it change your perspective?
For me, in my job working for the city, I conduct speaking engagements for vast areas, cornfields, all kind of stuff. So I would walk into a space where, because I took their requests, they weren't expecting me also to be the presenter. So that was definitely where I went to a space, I remember, and the children wouldn't come into the room. And she kept telling me they were okay, it's okay, you can go in. I'm like, am I okay? I didn't know that it was an issue. So for me, I've had to flow. No, don't let it get to me. Don't let it affect my presentation, and just act like it does not exist. But it definitely has been painful as a public servant, and to walk and to know that that's still a very real thing. And I worked at a clothing store, and the one child said to me, "Mommy, look at her lips," and I was like, "What's going?" I didn't even know that racism was as potent as it was until I was working at 16 years old. So that's just a real thing, and just and having to be strong all the time, like don't let it get to you. That has been a struggle. So I don't like to have race conversations, actually, because I know that I get emotional about it. And so I'm gonna listen to y'all, what y'all got to tell me to do about this. But yes, it's something that needs to be done. I just don't have it enough because of what I've experienced.
I'll say the pressure of learning how to react and respond, of having to be exceptional. In certain spaces, if I'm dressed like this or with, I think I look all right, I'm all right, but I have to wear a tailored suit to be viewed as the equal of my counterpart who might have on some Dockers and Sperry's. Right? Being viewed just because I speak standard English as super articulate, where I'm just being myself, right? Having to overachieve. And so what I would say is the first of all, keep the work ethic, but don't learn how to release and not internalize the pressure as someone who's considered a minority, okay? Minorities in terms of being underrepresented, right? Being a minority in terms of like economics or whatever, but never a minority in terms of mind and capacity, right? And become comfortable with your identity and just reach out, ask questions. I learned, in certain spaces, especially when I first started consulting, that, I felt like I had to have the answers. And the more experienced I became, I found out that you wield power by learning how to ask the right questions. And you gain access by asking the right questions. And so I just wanted to leave that with you.
I want to say to the audience that I think that the panel deserves a round of applause. It takes a tremendous amount of social capital and courage to come and just sit in your truth and to speak your truth and to share some of the wisdom and the values that you all have. I hope that this video, that this video will reach places and people that we will never know, right? And there may be some people, young, old, some people that look like us and some people that don't, that come back to this video as a point of reference and a point of strength. Right. My favorite time in my community, though, was always when the elders were gathering, but I could smell the food outside too. That was like my favorite time because I was anxious as a kid. Like, I know they got cake. And so on that note, for you all too, I want to say thank you. I want to say welcome. This has been the heavy. The after part will be the light. Right. And so I don't want to lose the symbolic meaning of this conversation. Right, this conversation was heavy, and I encourage you to interact with your panelists, to stop, get a card, to make a contact, to shake a hand, and please remember that we need to do our introductions for the video when we're done. But then I also encourage us to hear some music, to get some food, right, to take a slight break, and we'll convene back at 12 o'clock, well then we will do the second part of our cookout, which is where you will hear the laughter and the fun part and the collective healing. Because I really do think that in spaces like that, in spaces where we're not only together with us, right, but we've invited other people in and we're safe and there's no pressure, nothing to perform, that's where we heal. So I invite you to take a break, to stop, to let our panelists regroup, right, and then I'll meet you guys in 15 minutes by the catfish nuggets. Anybody okay? That work? All right, thank you.